On March 15th, 2023, something happened that should have been front-page news everywhere, but most Americans missed it completely. Saudi Arabia announced it would accept Chinese yuan for oil sales to China, not dollars, yuan. For the first time in 49 years, the world's largest oil exporter agreed to sell its most critical commodity in a currency other than the US dollar. The petrodollar monopoly, established in 1974, was broken. This wasn't just a trade deal. This was stage 6 of an 8-stage collapse pattern that has destroyed every reserve currency in history. The Portuguese real collapsed in the 1600s. The Dutch guilder collapsed in the 1700s. The British pound collapsed in the 1900s. And now, the US dollar is following the exact same pattern, stage by stage, crisis by crisis. And we are entering the most dangerous phase, where alternatives gain critical mass and the collapse accelerates exponentially. Here is what most people don't understand. Reserve currency status isn't permanent. It is a cycle that lasts 80 to 110 years. The currency rises, it dominates, it overextends, competitors emerge, confidence cracks, alternatives gain adoption, crisis accelerates, and replacement happens. We have seen this pattern 3 times in the last 500 years, and every single time, the dominant power refused to believe its currency could fall. They thought they were different. They thought their system was too big to fail. They were wrong, all of them. The dollar is currently in stage 6 of 8. Alternatives are gaining adoption. The petrodollar is cracking. BRICS nations are building parallel systems. And the timeline, based on historical patterns, says we have 10 to 15 years before the dollar loses reserve status entirely. Not eliminated, but no longer dominant. And when that happens, America's ability to print money and export inflation ends. The $36 trillion debt becomes unpayable. Interest rates spike. Living standards fall 30 to 40%. This is the most important economic story of our lifetimes, and almost no one is paying attention. Let me show you the exact 8-stage pattern that destroyed 3 previous reserve currencies. But first, you need to understand what a reserve currency actually is and why it matters. A reserve currency is the currency that countries around the world hold as their primary foreign exchange reserves. Central banks accumulate reserves to facilitate international trade, pay debts, and stabilize their own currencies. When a currency becomes the reserve currency, it creates massive advantages for the issuing country. First, structural demand. If every country needs dollars to trade internationally, they must constantly buy dollars. This creates permanent demand, regardless of the underlying economy. Second, seigniorage. The issuing country can print money and exchange it for real goods from other countries. You print paper, they give you cars, electronics, oil. This is an extraordinary privilege. Third, cheap borrowing. Because everyone needs your currency, they buy your government bonds. This lets you borrow at lower interest rates than economic fundamentals justify. Fourth, exported inflation. When you print money, the inflation is spread globally because everyone holds your currency. Your inflation becomes the world's problem. These 4 advantages are why reserve currency status is the ultimate economic weapon. But it is also why losing it is catastrophic. When your currency is no longer needed for trade, demand collapses. Your government can't borrow cheaply anymore. You can't print money without causing immediate domestic inflation. Your living standard, inflated by decades of special privilege, crashes back to what your actual economy can support. This is what happened to Portugal, the Netherlands, and Britain, and it is what is beginning to happen to America. Let me show you the 8-stage pattern. This framework applies to all three previous reserve currency collapses, and it is playing out with the dollar right now. Stage 1 is dominance, established through economic and military superiority. A currency becomes the reserve currency because the issuing country is the dominant economic and military power. This creates trust. Portugal in the 1500s controlled the spice trade. Portuguese ships dominated the route around Africa to India and the East Indies. Spices, pepper, cinnamon, cloves were worth more than gold by weight. Portugal controlled this trade through military superiority at sea and strategic ports like Goa, Malacca, and Macau. The Portuguese real became the currency of Asian trade. Merchants needed reals to buy spices. This made the real the reserve currency of Indian Ocean trade. But dominance doesn't last forever. It contains the seeds of its own destruction. Stage 2 is peak power and overextension. At the height of power, the dominant country overextends. It fights wars it can't afford. It borrows excessively. Portugal at peak power controlled the entire Indian Ocean spice trade, but it overextended. Portugal tried to maintain military presence in dozens of ports, from Mozambique to Macau. A small population, only 1 million people in Portugal itself, couldn't sustain a global empire. Wars with rival European powers drained resources. Portugal borrowed heavily from Italian and German bankers. By 1560, debt service consumed 60% of royal revenues. The real remained strong because of the spice monopoly, but the empire was financially rotting from the inside. Now consider the Dutch. The Dutch Republic in the 1600s had the most efficient economy in Europe. Amsterdam was the trading capital of the world. The Dutch East India Company, the VOC, was the richest corporation ever, worth $7.9 trillion in modern terms. Dutch ships controlled Baltic trade, Asian trade, and New World trade. The Dutch guilder became the reserve currency because Dutch financial markets were the most sophisticated. The Amsterdam Stock Exchange, founded in 1602, was the world's first. The Bank of Amsterdam, founded in 1609, was the world's most trusted bank. Everyone held guilders because Dutch finance was the safest and most liquid. But then came stage 3. Competitors emerge. The Dutch fought 3 wars with England and multiple wars with France. Military spending soared. The Dutch economy, based on trade and finance, couldn't support large-scale land wars. By 1700, the Dutch were spending more on defense than they earned from trade. Debt accumulated, but the guilder remained the reserve currency. Why? Inertia, and because of Amsterdam's financial infrastructure. Meanwhile, stage 4. Weaponization. Portugal, weakening, tried to exclude rival traders from its ports. They seized Dutch and English ships. This backfired. It forced rivals to build their own port networks. The Dutch established Batavia, Jakarta, as an alternative hub. By 1640, the Portuguese real represented less than 20% of Asian trade currency, down from 60%. The decline took 40 years, but once started, it accelerated. Then history repeated itself. Britain, at war with France, blockaded Dutch ports during the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War in the 1780s. Dutch trade collapsed. Merchants, unable to use Amsterdam, began using London banks instead. The network effect flipped. Once merchants realized London was safer, The guilder's decline was rapid. By 1815, the guilder held less than 10% of European reserves. The cycle didn't stop. It just moved west. Britain took the mantle. After defeating Napoleon in 1815, Britain was the global superpower. The Royal Navy controlled the seas. British industry dominated manufacturing. The British Empire covered 1/4 of the world's land and population. The British pound became the reserve currency. The gold standard, established by Britain, meant pounds were convertible to gold at fixed rates. This made pounds as good as gold. By 1900, 60% of international trade was invoiced in pounds. But then, the cycle repeated. Stage 2, overextension. Competitors emerged. Germany industrialized. America's economy surpassed Britain's by 1890. Britain fought the Boer War in 1899, which cost £200 million, 10% of its annual GDP. Britain maintained the world's largest navy at an enormous cost. They were borrowing to maintain an empire they could no longer afford. By 1914, Britain was a net debtor to America. World War I was the breaking point. It devastated British finances. Britain borrowed $4.2 billion from America to fight the war. And then, Britain made the fatal mistake: weaponization. During the war, Britain froze German assets in London. This signaled to the world that British banks weren't safe during a conflict. After the war, neutral countries reduced pound holdings, fearing their assets could be frozen too. The Great Depression in 1931 forced Britain off the gold standard, devaluing the pound by 30%. Trust evaporated. By 1945, Britain was bankrupt. The 1956 Suez Crisis was the final humiliation. America threatened to crash the pound if Britain didn't withdraw from the Suez Canal. Britain complied. From that moment, everyone knew. The pound was subordinate to the dollar. The network effect had flipped. Merchants preferred dollars because America was the new dominant power. Now, look at America. The cycle is identical. America at peak power in 1950 had no rivals. But then came Vietnam, the Cold War, Iraq, Afghanistan. Military spending soared. By 2008, U.S. debt was $10 trillion. Today, it is $36 trillion. But the dollar remained dominant because there were no alternatives. Until America made the same mistake Britain did: weaponization. This happened in two phases. First, 2014. Sanctions on Russia after Crimea. Russia responded by dumping its dollar reserves from $130 billion to near zero by 2020 and buying gold. Second, and this was the fatal blow, 2022. After the Ukraine invasion, America froze $300 billion of Russian central bank reserves. Russia was cut off from SWIFT. This was the nuclear option, and it backfired catastrophically. Every country watching, China, Saudi Arabia, India, Brazil, realized one thing: if we disagree with America, our money is gone. The result was mass de-dollarization. China reduced U.S. Treasury holdings from $1.3 trillion to $775 billion. Central banks globally bought over 1,100 tons of gold annually, the highest level since the 1970s. The weaponization that was supposed to punish Russia instead convinced the entire non-Western world to build alternatives. This brings us to today. Stage 6. Alternatives gain critical mass. In 2022, 73% of international trade was invoiced in dollars. By 2024, it fell to 58%. That is a 15 percentage point drop in just 2 years. This is the network effect flipping. Merchants are choosing non-dollar currencies because their trading partners accept non-dollar currencies. China's CIPS payment system processed $27 trillion in 2023, doubling in just 3 years. BRICS announced plans for a common currency backed by gold and commodities. The Petrodollar agreement, the bedrock of dollar dominance, is effectively dead. Saudi Arabia joined BRICS. The UAE accepts yuan. The timeline is accelerating. Digital finance means moving billions takes seconds, not weeks like in 1914. The transition that used to take decades can now happen in years. What triggers Stage 7? Crisis acceleration? It could be a BRICS currency launch. It could be a U.S. debt crisis where bond markets revolt. It could be a banking crisis caused by commercial real estate defaults. Whatever the trigger, the result is the same. Panic diversification. The dollar falls 30 to 50% against real assets. The Federal Reserve will be forced to choose between two disasters. Option 1, print money. Buy the treasuries that foreigners are dumping. This causes massive inflation. Option 2, raise rates. Defend the dollar by hiking interest rates to 10 or 15%. This causes a Great Depression. There is no good option. When the dollar loses reserve status, America loses the ability to export its inflation. The $800 billion annual trade deficit becomes unsustainable. Import prices skyrocket. Living standards fall 30 to 40%. So, who wins? And who loses? Gold holders win. In every previous currency collapse, Portugal, Netherlands, Britain, gold purchasing power surged. Commodity exporters win. They gain pricing power in a multipolar world. BRICS nations win. They gain economic independence. But dollar savers, bond holders, people living on fixed incomes in America, they lose. The purchasing power of their savings evaporates. The wealth transfer from dollar holders to hard asset holders will be the largest in history. The pattern is undeniable. Stage 1, dominance. Stage 2, overextension. Stage 3, competitors. Stage 4, weaponization. Stage 5, confidence cracks. Stage 6, critical mass. We are here. The petrodollar is dying. The reserve status is ending. The timeline suggests we have 10 to 15 years, but the crisis could start much sooner. History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes. And right now, it is rhyming with the collapse of every empire that came before.